In 2001, RuneScape went through a housing crisis. The game had just 142 player-owned houses, yet thousands of players were desperate to own one. But when every house disappeared overnight without warning, it set off a chain of events that would take years to resolve. This is the story of RuneScape's housing crisis, and the unusual road to a solution. When RuneScape launched in 2001, it was a completely different game from what we know today. Players chose a class during account creation, PvP combat was enabled everywhere unless you opted out, and surprisingly, there were no banks. It was really dangerous. If you died to another player, you'd lose everything but your 3 most valuable items and your levels. To put it into today's terms, it's like if you played a PvP world-locked Ultimate Iron Man, but on a map that instead of being this big, was only this big. But you might notice something about this map that doesn't exist in RuneScape today. Not that Edgeville is named Ghost Town, but here on the east side of Varrock, a large section of player-owned houses. You're in for a surprise because 99% of RuneScape's player base has never gotten to see what these actually looked like until now. Unlike most real-life neighborhoods, the houses here ranged from shacks to mega mansions. So let's take a look at a few. First up, we have 3 massive apartment buildings. In total, each building contained 24 3x3 tile big rooms. They were small and cramped, but having your own space in the game's biggest city wasn't too shabby. Next is the smallest, most basic house, a pretty quaint 3x4 tile 1-story home. It's a pretty nice starter place, if you can handle your closest neighbor being a giant rat. I guess that's not too bad. I've had worse neighbors, probably. The next step up are these 4x4 tile homes. They have an upstairs that's just as big as the ground floor and a cute little front yard. Then things get pretty nice. Here are the 6x6 tile homes. They're pretty spacious and you have a front yard and a backyard. Then we get to the really cool houses. This mansion-like building is seriously impressive. It's 4 stories tall, the only home to have a basement, and in total contains 11 rooms, as well as a small front and backyard. But the last house has to be my favorite. It's another big one with 9 rooms and has both a front yard and this cool little back courtyard. I feel like a fountain and some benches would look real nice here. You might be wondering, how much would it cost to live in one of these? Well, unfortunately, on the game's launch, they were impossible to access. The closest you could get was this gate. Andrew Gower, the game's programmer and founder, hadn't quite finished them yet. The plan was, once they were completed, players could place a chest inside to safely store items away from other players, as well as display furniture and decorations. But an update this massive would take quite a long time, and Andrew, along with his brothers Paul and Ian, had their attention elsewhere. Although they had formed a company to run the game called Jagex, they were still its only employees. RuneScape had only just launched, and with just a few dozen players active, housing wasn't exactly a top priority. But to hold players over and allow them to save at least some of their wealth if they died, banks were added to the game just 19 days after it launched. However, they could only hold coins, and just one existed. Despite the long wait, players were rabid for any update about when player-owned houses might finally arrive. So much so that after every game update, they'd rush over to check if the gate had finally opened, only to be disappointed every single time. That is, until one day when someone walked over and saw something strange. A player named Die somehow made it inside the gate. But how did he do it? Did he find some sort of glitch? It turns out Andrew Gower had placed him in there by accident. Die was involved in something that players back then referred to as the Varrock bank robbery. The day that RuneScape's first bank launched, the vault in the basement could be entered and players could steal items from it. When Andrew discovered this, he walled off the vault and teleported everyone inside of it out. One of those players was Die. Andrew made a slight miscalculation and teleported him to the player-owned housing area, where he had remained for the last 2 months. There was no free home teleport back then, so he couldn't easily escape. Now, after players discovered Die inside this area, Andrew was alerted and came over to teleport him out. But Die wanted to stay. I think he liked being somewhere that no one else could access and probably liked the attention too. Thanks to Dai, we learned that the housing update was still a long way away. All the area had was all of the empty buildings I've talked about so far, and a random man who you could fight, I guess. If only chunk-locked Iron Men existed back then, I have a feeling they would have loved this place. Over the following months, RuneScape received exciting updates, like the addition of the Champions Guild, the Vampire Slayer quest, and numerous quality of life improvements and bug fixes. However, there was still no sign of the player-owned houses opening anytime soon. That was until April of 2001, when Paul Gower made a post to the RuneScape forums titled "Player-owned houses opening today if ... The post says, "Today, if Mika Hakkinen wins Formula 1 Grand Prix, I'm going to open player-owned houses today. If Schumacher wins, I'm not going to open houses never. If someone else wins, I open houses after 2 months. So put your thumbs up for Mika Hakkinen." This thread quickly became one of the most popular posts on the forums ever, with 40 replies in less than an hour. Everyone was hoping Mika would win, but he ended up not finishing the race at all. But hey, at least Schumacher didn't win. I think even if Mika did win, players would be very disappointed, as Paul posted this on April 1st, which means it was probably some cruel April Fool's joke. Oddly enough, all of Paul's posts disappeared from the forum soon after this, so some players theorized that he was actually hacked and this was some mean player trying to prank everyone. But I like to think that Andrew just told Paul to stop teasing the players. Regardless, the houses weren't ready yet, and every day, more and more players were joining the game. If they didn't finish the update soon, then there might not be enough houses for everyone. So, 5 days later, on April 6th, RuneScape would get its largest expansion yet, with an update that nearly doubled the size of the world map. This update brought 4 new quests, Port Sarim, the Ice Mountain, Goblin Village, and most importantly, the city of Falador. On the east side of the city was even more player housing. 6 3x4 tile houses, 2 4x4 tile houses with an upstairs and a small front garden, an apartment building with 16 3x3 rooms, and the star of the show, this massive castle. Additionally, there was a large blank space left open for future expansions. Now, even with a decent increase in available housing, it wasn't enough for every player to own one. By now, the game had thousands of signed up players, and was seeing peak online counts of about 1,000. But Andrew still didn't want to give up on the idea. 2 weeks later, we would get some more details on how players would obtain a house when they were ready for purchase. First of all, the houses wouldn't have a set price. Instead, they would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Also, given the high demand for one, Andrew commented that the only people who would likely be able to afford one would be clans. Large clans could purchase the mega mansions, while smaller ones would get to experience what it's like living in New York City. It seemed like every day the player-owned house feature was becoming less and less viable, but progress on them continued. In May, Andrew would attempt to rework some of the houses in Varrock to fit more people. Although he never finished it, it looked like the apartments were going to shrink from 3x3 rooms to 2x3, meaning each building would have 36 rooms instead of 24. However, by July, Andrew and his brothers finally accepted that this feature just wasn't going to happen. There was so little housing available that less than 5% of the active player base was going to be able to live in one, and that number was shrinking every day. So on the 26th of July 2001, they made the tough decision to strip them out of the game. Although some of them did survive in some form. The big mansion in Falador would later become the party room, and this tiny house in Varrock with the rat neighbor still exists in Old School and RS3 today. Time has actually been pretty good to you, buddy. You look a lot better than you used to. Now, to make up for canning the game's most hyped future update, they would introduce 2 major updates on the same day to compensate. First was that banks could now hold items. Now you could protect your items from other players without having to pass by your neighbor's cybering. Second was the introduction of the game's first rune items. Jagex felt bad that players had been saving up hundreds of thousands of GP in hopes of buying a house, so they wanted to give them something to spend their money on. Now, even though player-owned houses were gone, the Gower brothers didn't want to give up on the concept. For now, it was back to the drawing board to figure out how to make them a reality. About a month later, the Wilderness was introduced. Outpost, a dedicated area for player versus player combat, and the rest of the world was transformed into a safe zone. This update brought with it two items that players took a special interest in: planks and tiles. They spawned throughout the wilderness and, at the time, served no purpose. Players speculated that these items might one day be used for building houses, but that was quickly shut down when Ian Gower said that they were just added for ambiance. But most of the player base at the time wasn't old enough to know what ambiance meant, so the hype continued. Then, a month later, nails were added to the game. Player-owned houses confirmed? Actually, they were added for the Dragon Slayer quest, where nails and the previously useless planks were needed to repair the Lady Lumbridge ship. Players in Classic had a bit longer to go before anything housing related would be announced. Fast forwarding to April 30th, 2002, the thieving skill was added to RuneScape. But that's not the part of the update that we're actually interested in. Along with this update came a silent feature. Not only was thieving added to your stats tab, so was a skill called carpentry. You couldn't train it, but it clearly had something to do with building your own house, and was on the way. Surely, Jagex would do something with this skill soon, and not just silently remove it 8 months later. You probably guessed it, but that's exactly what happened. Once again, Jagex had given up on player-owned housing, and this time it would be for quite a while. It would take another 4 years for the Gower brothers' dream to finally become a reality. By 2006, RuneScape was in a completely different place. The game had undergone a massive graphics overhaul, attracted hundreds of thousands of active players, and was generating millions of dollars in revenue annually. They now finally had the tools and the staff to launch a player-owned housing system. But this time, they didn't want to hype it up too much. They tried that last time and nothing came of it, and people just got mad. So players were in for a big surprise when they woke up on May 31st, 2006 to see that RuneScape's newest skill, Construction, had been released without warning. With this skill, players could finally purchase and customize their very own houses. Instead of existing on the world map like the Gower brothers had originally planned, houses would be accessed through portals, where they sort of just exist out in the void. This way, the game would never run out of space for houses, and you don't have to live next to a rat. Player-owned houses weren't just about having a cool place to show off. They've since become an essential part of every RuneScape player's experience. Whether you're an endgame PVMer who needs lots of teleports and a stat rejuvenation pool, or just a chill guy who likes to go to house parties, there's a lot of benefits for everyone. Despite how cool it would have been, I'm pretty glad we didn't get houses back in 2001, because the system we have today is about as close to perfect as it gets. Plus, can you imagine how much those houses would cost today? Instead of complaining to your friends that you didn't buy Bitcoin in 2012, you'd be like, oh man, I wish I bought that house in RuneScape. Anyway, if you like this video, you'll love the one on the right, all about RuneScape's first year. There were hitmen, citywide clan wars, and so much more.